Hey, my name's Bruce Snell. I'd like to welcome you to class number 11 today. It's working on defining your organization's order request systems. We're right now in part 3, class 11, and we're really in this particular part are dealing with what we call the system base. Look at lining up and kind of defining the systems internally within the organization. What we're going to focus on this class today is that we're going to focus on the order request and how each of us internally within the organization is processing some part of that order request. Okay, if you'll turn to page 1 of your handout, and let's look at the order request executive summary. And it says, think of an order request as a purchase order. Reason we're saying that is that we need the same good data that's on a purchase order, that what is it, the quantity, who, the time, and the whole bit, to make sure that we meet the terms and conditions of that work order or order request internally within the organization. And that's throughout the organization. And what we're saying is that we have to look at how each of our processes or base work centers affect our product or service that we're providing to the marketplace. The interesting thing, what we're saying is that the order request is the beginning of the process. And what we're saying there, quality starts at the beginning of the process. Because if we basically take an incomplete work order or a verbal order request, is that what's going to happen is that basically that deal's doomed from day one. So what we're saying, quality begins at the beginning of the process. Not halfway through the process, but at the beginning. And it all begins with an order request. And what we're saying, an order request, it needs to be, there's two types. Formal, which is a written order request, and informal, which is a verbal. And we've all had those verbal order requests. We call them hallway pass-offs. Walking down the hall and holler at somebody to do something. Then we're 2 to 3 weeks down the road and the deal hasn't been done. If we're looking at the definition of order, and we'll go over this in our terms a little later on, but an order is from our external customer. Our request is from our internal customer and supplier. So if you look at, there still has to be a formal process, whether we're getting our external order from our customer or a request, or either we're requesting internally within our organization. Because remember, statistically, 67% of we lose our customers is because something we've done internally within the organization has nothing to do with competition. It's something that we did internally within the organization to basically aggravate them. Number 2 is the processing of the order request. When we have a formal order request, basically that thing's agreed upon and it's accountable. Agreed upon, when it's in written form, means that whoever is handing it off to the next base work center, we've agreed on the terms and conditions, events and actions, so we're accepting that particular work order, and that becomes accountable. How many times we got involved in a deal that we were doing something, then all of a sudden it goes sideways and everybody's there is pointing fingers. This is it. This is the thing that kind of is fascinating, is that we step back and say, I don't have time to put it in writing, but isn't it amazing how we all have time to do it again? And it's usually with a sense of urgency, because somewhere we dropped a ball, and that ball we're handing off to our customer. An informal order request is what we call interpretation time. Because when you have an informal, all I'm doing, we've talked about the 4 barriers to quality. We talked about all our base skills and why everything's so important to think about who that person is receiving that order. They're receiving that order based off of what we term their prejudiced perception, based off of their past business life, their home life, and everything else under the sun. So when we're looking at an informal, it's interpretation time. I'm doing what I think you want. The outcome of the order processing of the order request is formal, greater chance of success. Why? The reason it has a greater chance because it's written down. And if not, then we can review or improve or correct the outcome. Informal, it's a hit and a miss, and if it is a hit and a miss, sometimes we get it to the customer, sometimes we don't, and then how in the world are we going to improve something or define something or fix something when it's informal and not written? The data collection of the order request. When it's a formal written order request, we have good data going in, good data out. Informal, again, we're collecting and dealing with bad data, so we don't have good data to basically give us a direction of why we either met the terms and conditions or the reason we didn't. Customer satisfaction. We want to step back and look at how many times most of our customers and most of us will do anything if we're told advance or if you keep your commitment or your word. And customers will work around anything. Is that if we're looking at the satisfaction of formal is good, meaning that we can improve it, we've agreed on it, the customer knows and expects what they have given us to process for them. Informal, it's a hit and a miss, both customer satisfaction and improving. Informal, sometimes we hit it, sometimes we don't. Continuous improvement of the product and service. In a formal situation, meaning a written process for that order request, we now have something written that we can now look at basically to improve or to continuously improve or to fix that or figure out why in the world that thing's doing right or not. Informal, there's no starting point. It becomes very frustrated. Have any of y'all ever been frustrated internally within your organization? You get this verbal thing and all of a sudden we're all jumping through hoops and it's nothing to do with what they thought that they told you. And so now all of a sudden the frustration, it seems like no matter what we're doing, we're not doing things right and we're doing things over and over. Really, all we're doing is the receipt, the processing, the delivery of our order request. And if you'll look at that chart down below, it says we're receiving that order request from either our external customer or internal supplier. What we're saying there, remember, all this stuff focuses around, we're breaking the entire organization down by base work centers. Remember, base work center is kind of a process linked together by internal customer and suppliers that make up the systems internally within the organization. So if you look at that, I am receiving, if it's an order, I'm receiving it from our external customer, and if it's a request, I'm receiving it or giving it to my internal supplier or customer. So if you look at this, we're saying that an order that we're receiving is external, request is that we're either making a request to our internal supplier. I need an inventory, I need basically paper for the copier. That's what we're talking about, an internal request. So I get my order request, I process it. Meaning, remember, all of us in the organization is supporting some part of our order request. It's either processing, it's either supporting, or one of the two plus servicing. So if you look at it, we're all there handling one little part of that order request. That's why it's so important to understand what's acceptable or not acceptable. So we get the order, we process it, and then what happens is that once we basically have completed our base work center, we now hand it off to what we call our internal customer. Remember, in the process and in the base work center, we have agreed on what's acceptable or not. And so where we're saying, let's stop bad or non-quality dead in its track. So if we're receiving that order, and I'll say as an informal order or request, I'm not going to accept it. That's not what we've agreed on. So we've agreed on what we're going to accept or not. Same thing here. I'm doing my process. Now I give it to my internal customer. Now that's another quality check, is that they're not going to accept it. How we usually do this thing, how do we usually do quality? We react to the phone call after the product or service is already done out in the workplace, or out in our customer's workplace. By the time we do that, that thing's costing us about 100 times of what that order request was. So that's our executive summary over the order request, and that's where we're focusing at today. If you look at your base work center, simply speaking, all of us are processing some step of our order request, product, or service. It says, if you really think of it, this is what we've been talking about the whole deal here. All of us are basically processing, supporting, or servicing some part of our order request internally within the organization. And it says a product and or service. Product and or service is that you or I are either supporting, We either manufacturing or processing a product or a combination of both, but everybody there is supporting that effort. One of the things that we talk about that's really important by Base Work Center is to be able to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor. And if you look at 2.1, we're saying if we've agreed on an event and action of that order request, we have to make sure we manage, plan, schedule, and monitor it. This is one of the issues that we talked about so much in our base skills and stuff, is that why it's so important internally within the organization that everybody has those base skills. Because if I'm ordering, basically if I'm receiving an order or request and I'm able to plan, schedule, manage, and monitor, but nobody else in the organization is, how good are my skills? What's the chance of success of that order request getting through the process? It's not very good. So if you look at the MPSM, is that everybody internally within the organization in their base work center need to look at managing, planning, scheduling, and monitoring that order request. And the undertaking of the MPSM is that we also want to look at in the processing the 4 M's, which is manpower, machine, material, and methods. So if you look at it, all the MPSM, the 4 M's, which is again, manpower, machine, material, and methods are all affected by the 4 barriers to quality. So let's think about this for a second. So let's say that, example, that we all have our processes and systems in place and we're all managing, planning, scheduling, and monitoring, and we're all really doing a pretty good job. How does the 4 barriers to quality? Will the 4 barriers to quality affect that? Yes, it will. That's why we're saying it's so important to understand the 4 barriers to quality and its effect, not only on the organization, but our people in that organization. Remember, the 4 barriers to quality are fear of expression or action, lack of communication, verbal, written, lack of written procedure, and lack of training. And we're saying we can't train until we have written procedure developed by the people doing the job. We can't get that until we have open and honest communication. Can't get that until we remove the fear of expression or action. Number 3, we're talking about availabilities to process the order request of our product or service. We want to look at the capacities of the 4 M's. There's nothing worse in the world that we can do is to take an order and not be able to meet our terms and conditions. We lose more face, more customers by wanting to get out, get all the business, but then we can't support that product or service. So we need to look at the capacities of the manpower, machine, material, and methods. And inventory, that's another thing we usually don't figure on until we're out of something. Now all of a sudden we're going to do some inventory management. And usually the inventory management has to do with we're out, we got to order some. So, and y'all think about how many times that thing happens from even the copying paper. And I use that because that happens in a lot of times in a lot of companies that I'm in. And a lot of times we don't even have someone ordering it. So if you look at, we can be doing a big deal internally within the organization. We're running off the proposal. Now we got to make 10 copies of the proposal. We're out of paper. How good is all that work? That's what we're saying. Everybody in the organization's process or supporting of that order request is so key and important for the overall success. So if you look at, we need our inventory existing and lead times, because this is where the planning and scheduling comes in, is that we need internally by Base Work Center able to understand what we can and we can't do, and if we're involved in a deal, example, if it's a 6-month or 6-week lead time or 3 weeks, which most of us do have, is that I don't need to get that order request one week before we have to process it because we're already 2 weeks behind. This is the reason that we all have to communicate internally within the organization and agree on what we can and can't do. Data support. How do you manage and monitor the daily events and action of the organization? We're looking at data entry, collection, and reporting to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor. So if you look at it, all of us are not only processing some part of our order request, but there's some kind of something that we're collecting data-wise to say that we processed our part of it. That's how we manage the organization. Why to give focus to the base work centers and organization? Remember, what we're saying here is so important in the organization is that we have that focus by Base Work Center. We try to tackle this formalizing this organization. It's way too complicated trying to drive it from the top. We've got to get everybody in the organization. And the data support, we can use it reporting monthly, quarterly, updates, or where in the world are we at. So if we got a good system in place, or a system in place, a written or formal one, is that chances are we can now sit down and manage, plan, schedule, and monitor all those different things of tying in not only our base work centers, but managing, planning, and scheduling my base work center to support or process or produce some part of that order request. Continuous improvement of the product and service. What we're saying here is that we have to deal with data. No more kind of what ifs or kind of what we think it should be or our interpretation. We have to get this deal done with data, and that is past. Let's look at our past data. Now, the past data is going to tell us kind of what in the world has been happening. We want to look at present, and we're saying, are we current? Let's review the schedule of our order request, and then we can back up and work on our planning to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor. The projected, where are we at and where are we going to go, and are we on our goals and our projections internally within the organization, and processed. We also want to look at the orders requests that we have processed, because we can check all this stuff back and forth to see if we're meeting the terms and conditions of our commitments to our customers. So if you look at that, that's why we have to formalize, why we have to break it down by base work centers. One person way up here at the top is powerless to understand, not only to understand, but to have impact on all these connecting base work centers. So that's our base work center, simply speaking, focusing on our product and service. If you look at on page 3, this is a typical order request system. What we're saying here by base work center is that the goal is to define and agree on a written process of the job, the paper process, not at this time defining the skills. Caution with do whatever I have to do. What you're going to see as we get into organizations and you start nosing around in your own organization, what we usually get is that I do everything under the sun, or I do whatever I have to, and I'm going, how in the world can you manage, plan, schedule, and monitor everything under the sun? And how are you going to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor everything that I got to do? You can't. That's reactive. And so what we're saying there is that we really need to get a good handle on where we're at. So on page 3 is that we're looking at a typical order request. And if you look at, we're saying here is kind of a process suggestion, paper process for most of us internally within the organization. The startup, what we're saying is the startup, we usually clock in. Well, how do we collect that data? Well, we're saying with a time card, log in, or sign in. Then step 2, or item 2, is preparation for the day. All of us have different things. When we have mechanics and techs out in the shop, they maybe get dressed after they clock in. Some of us, like me, I'm usually kind of the first guy in the office. I turn on the copier to get that bad boy heated up and make the coffee. So if you look at it, what is it that we're doing? And we also want to try to plan in there as we move through the organization to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor the day. Remember, how do most of us do? We're reactive. We're addressing that fire of the day. So the data collection, if we look at the startup, I receive my work from. We're asking you, when you're looking at, as you accept that order request, who do you receive that work from? Who do you receive that order request from? And in that, we want you to look at, is it a job order? Is it a work order? Is it a pick ticket, receiving log, flow routine, route? What we're saying that we really need to focus on where I get my work from. Now, one of the problems that's going to come up is that I got everybody in the company giving me work. Woo. Well, we already know what's going to happen there. We're juggling about 50 different things, and eventually we're going to drop one. And what you're going to see is that whether come heck or high water, I am going to get blamed sometime internally within the organization for dropping the ball, and I'm working 11 to 12 hours a day and I'm frustrated and can't keep up. And so that's what we're saying there, is that we need to focus in, bring in who am I receiving that order request from. And we're saying that if you're walking in and just say, I just start and just do whatever the world happens to be there, chances are you're the champion firefighter. And that's how most of us and most of these informal systems internally within the organization have evolved. Okay, let's look at item number 4, start processing work. What do I do? Do we log of the work? We start the job sheet, we set up the processes, pull order request, inventory request, job log, schedule, manage, plan, schedule, or monitor. What is it that we're doing? Now, depending on where we're at in this order request system internally within the organization, I can be up front in basically one process, looking at managing and planning this thing through the organization. I can be in another part of the organization that I'm receiving my order request, and basically I am going to process it. You're giving me my work daily. One of the issues, and we'll get into this in a little bit, is internally the support staff, office worker, and management is really a tough base work center to look at in that order request. Because what you will find is that, especially internally within the office, a lot of our stuff is verbal. I'm asked to do this, I'm asked to do that, and then all of a sudden we're working night and day and we're not accomplishing anything, or we're accomplishing a lot and very frustrated and about burnout on the thing. So if you look at, we're going, what do I do? So we're looking at, you receive it, what is it, what part are you doing to support that order request? And then we're saying the startup, skill for processing, could insert different base work centers, data collections, skill certification, qualification. We're looking at there is at the skill. What is it that I have to have skill in order to process that order request? You have to have welding certification. You might have to have Microsoft 1000 or 10,000 or whatever it is out there now. But we're saying here, what are those skills that I need internally within the organization to process my order request? And then we're saying, number 6, stop processing work. What is the processing? At the end of it, we're looking at, I've completed my job, I've completed my part of that process, me basically doing my product, service, or supporting of that order request. And then we're going, when we stop or complete, we're looking at handing it off, we complete accounting, reporting a job cleanup, log, completion, sign off. So what we're saying here, maybe out in the shop, we might have to clean up. Example, if we're putting together truck engines, we might have to clean up after each job. Or example, in like the studio business, you get through with a shoot, you might have to clean up the set, take it down, put it up, or whatever. We're saying also internally within the organization is that after I complete this one job as an office support personnel, that I either have to give it to someone, or I get another order request, or I go about doing something else. But there's going to be somewhere that's going to say, what do we do after we complete that order request? And we have to have the accounting of it. And the number 7, I give my completed work to. Who, what, or where do I give my completed work to? The paperwork, is it log, units, produced, time, materials, labor, work order? So we're processing it, we're working on it, who do we give that thing to? So what we want to do is that look at then how are we, this is what we were talking earlier about the data collection, because this data collection is going to show us throughout the organization the path of that order request. So if you look at by having everybody's process linked together by internal customer and supplier in a formal process, we're able to tell where we've got either a bottleneck in the process, we got a problem, and what you find is that usually your people in your organization know where the problem is. It's the 4 barriers that prevent them from getting involved on the deal. And then it says here, preparation for the end of the day. After I've completed, and there's several, there's a lot of base work centers that I process several, let's just say order requests or work orders, or I'm pulling reports as support staff for my boss. But we're saying at the end of the day now, I've completed my job. I might go through this process several times, but at the end of the day, we turn in, download the day's paperwork, reporting, prep for the next day, lock up, turn off, turn on, clean up, manage, plan, schedule, and monitor the next day. This is where we want to get that at the end of the day that we're able to manage and plan, schedule, and monitor for our next day. But if you look at it toward the end of the day, what is it that we have to do or required to do? And we'll have to come to an agreement on that. And at the end of the day, if nothing else, we clock out time card. And again, that's the data collection. So if you look at it, it talks about the startup process and all these different items, 1 through 9. And then we're looking at, as we're starting and receiving that, we're also processing certain things, and then we're also having to collect data. Why do we have to collect data? Number one is that we want to make sure that we've met the terms and conditions of that order request for our customer, and also too, we have to manage what in the world that we're doing and where we're at internally in that order request process. All right, let's look now at page number 4. Page number 4 is the order request process and step. What we're wanting you to do is to look at internally within the organization. A good way to start is to look at, remember, our process and steps is just like flow charting. We've all done the flow chart stuff before, or process mapping, or whatever you want to call it. So worst case, best case, let's look at, we get maybe a task team together, or by base work center. One thing to do, I would suggest first, is that you get all the folks together that have or touch that order request process. And I would start with the people that have the most influence and look at forming a task team and keep that task team between 4 and 7 people. You get more than that, you're not going to be able to accomplish nothing. So if you look at that, let's, number one, agree on that process and step of that order request throughout the organization. And what we're saying there is that, if nothing else, let's focus on the base work centers or the processes that are touching that as we move through the organization. Because what that's going to do, that process and step overall, is going to line up what base work centers need to be involved in this order request, defining and formalizing that order request by base work center. So remember, as we go from one base work center to the next, we're basically receiving from our internal supplier and we're doing our process, and then we're giving it to our internal customer. So the first thing I would do is suggest that we look at organization-wide, believe me, it sounds kind of simple, but it's not, is that you need to look at overall organization order requests, just kind of line up those base work centers in that process and step form. And we want you to name, up top it says process and steps for order request. I would take 2 separate ones and look at your internal request. Now this is another interesting thing that happens internally within these organizations. We have these companies that, remember how we said most organizations just evolve, and they evolve in informal structure. So what happens is, I usually get internally within these companies, we've got people that are trying to nail down what's happening internally, and they create their own internal request, if nothing else. So then as we get in and start looking at it, we discover that out of 10 different departments, we might have 7 different order request or request internally. What we need to do is agree on one process. And so sometimes you get a little resistance because these folks have put in a lot of good time, energy, and effort. But what we want to do is take that expertise that they have, because they've developed it, and get them in on that task team to approve it. So again, if you look at, we need to look at the order request. That's 2 separate processes. One for the order, which is external. Internal is the request. So let's look at page number 5. Now the interesting thing here, we can sit here and do these process and step flow charts, process mapping, systems improvement. If we're not writing procedure, we might as well throw this mess out the window, because it ain't going to do any good. So again, let's look at this. For each of those process and steps, we're probably going to need a written procedure. Now remember, one of the interesting things we talked about, who in the world is the best person to tell us how to do the job? The guy doing the job. So who do you think is going to be the best person to write a procedure for that particular step in that process? The person doing the job. It keeps coming back of why we have to have all these base work center skills, base skills, that are literally, if you look at it through the organization, they're transferable. No matter where you go, you're going to be using all these skills. By the end of this certification here, you're going to look at why all this stuff that we're talking about keeps showing up in each class, because you can't go here until you define here. And these are the skills and the base skills that we need to work on. So if you look at it, one thing of the order request, we not only want to tie it to the process and reference what particular step it is, but we also want to put the name of the base work centers on the top. Why do we want to do that? We want to do that because we want to make sure that if we change the procedure, we want to make sure all the base work centers that touch or are a part of that process are involved in the fixing of that thing. Let's look now at page number 6. Now, page number 6 is the order request for our product and service terms. As I got through this thing, in a lot of different companies, our terms and terminology, everybody had different interpretation. Another interesting thing is that we never really knew the terms or the definition of those terms. We kind of just used them loosely. And then, in fact, that's where a lot of the misfiring came from, because I was looking or using a term different than what you were. So we basically went through this thing and lined out the terms to give you an idea of what we're talking about. The manage, of course, is to manage the day-to-day business of the order request. Who should be managing? All of us should be managing our process and step, our part in supporting that order request. Remember, order request is external, request is internal. Product or service, a product is basically something that is produced. A service is something that we do to meet the needs internally or externally of our customer. Sometimes they intermingle. We have both product and service, and we're internal is internally within the organization. Number 4, external is external to the organization. Supplier is who we get our work from, and customer is who we give our work to. A quick check. Number 5 is kind of what we're saying here. We have a tendency to accept that order request, and we're not sure if we can meet the terms or conditions. We're so hungry to get that order request, but we haven't checked with the base work centers that are involved. We're saying a quick check is, example, you remember earlier we talked about capacities and inventory. We're saying here is that if we take an order and we're promised it in 2 weeks, and remember our lead time was 3 weeks or 4, we have just agreed to not perform for our customer. Now, so what we're wanting to say is it doesn't take much to go through the process. That's why we need to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor with data and have processes to do that, to where we can sit down and look and see if we can meet the terms and conditions. So a quick check is that it have to go to 4 or 5 base work centers. And if you're thinking there's a bottleneck or we're behind, or if there has been issues or it's a part of the procedure, check with those folks. It doesn't take long to do that. Planning, scheduling, and processing. Planning is basically planning what in the world we're going to be doing, and scheduling is scheduling what we plan. And then the processing, we're either manufacturing, assembly, or service, basically supporting that order request throughout the organization. Inventory can be anything, warehousing of a raw finished product or basically product or service waiting for processing, servicing, and or delivering. Let's look at staging. Now this is we probably have all heard of those systems gap. Well, we're saying here staging occurs kinda if you look at it throughout the whole organization. I've completed or processed my paperwork, my form, my work order, and I hand it to the next base work center. What we're saying there is that sometimes that thing sits before it's picked up again. And so whether it is a form or paper process that we're working through, or it's out on the shop floor that we're actually, let's say, milling a part on a CNC machine, we finish that, we stack it over here for the next CNC machine. So if you look at somewhere or somehow or some form in these gaps and in this staging process are problems. Sometimes it gets lost, we're not communicating properly. So if you look at between each of these handoffs, we can say could be a staging platform. And then the delivery is basically delivering to our internal, external customers and suppliers on what our commitments were. Manage, plan, schedule, and monitor. Number 1213, again, is monitoring the order request of our product or service. That's why it's so important. We have to have the formal systems in here. Usually how we monitor is when we get a call from our customer and they haven't gotten what we told them we'd get to them. So now they're on the phone. And then that just starts a whole series of things that could go sideways. If you look at number 7, page number 7 is our order request form. We've kind of basically have put together a generic form for you to look at that you can use as an order request, internal or external. There's certain characteristics, if you look at it, on no matter what your order request form, and sometimes we find that we have incomplete order request forms that you really want to look at. That's why we're saying look at it as a purchase order. Look at it that we have to have that kind of detail on this order request, whether it's internal or external, to make sure that that job gets done on what we've committed to. And so down at the bottom of this thing, it talks about who's it from, who's it going to, who's it assigned to, and it also talks about, you'll see some items, log, reference, required, schedule, and completed. This is how we're going to start formalizing this system of our order request internally within the organization. So if you looked at it now, we've looked at working on our process and steps. We're suggesting first to do a quick process and step overall for your order request in your organization. Now, basically, if nothing else, let's outline those base work centers that are involved in that and the paperwork that are involved. Now let's look at, as we're formalizing that, that's going to tell us what base work centers that we need to be involved in to formalize that order request process, steps, and that procedure. Remember, the best guy to tell you how to do the job is the person that's doing it. So that's kind of a little order request, and whether you have an order request or not, this might be something good for you to look and see if you've got all that information on there. Because again, we even have signature. We've been into some companies to where it's a little tough because of past history, and we have to get everybody to sign off on it, which is not a bad idea, especially when you're looking at going through long-term deals. And we'll get into some of that strategic planning stuff, and we'll get into some of these things as far as engineering a particular product or service that we've agreed to. And that can be a number of different things. So we want to make sure that we get it signed off through the process. And as we're developing these formalized process and steps and procedures, what this also does is that the system becomes the bad guy. Because with an informal organization, an informal order request system, what happens is that I'm not getting what I want, so I go to you, and then all of a sudden you're picking on me. And when there's not an agreed upon process, step, procedure, then is that it becomes very personal because of the 4 barriers and because of the things that we've experienced and at the organization and our past employer. So if nothing else, now the formal system becomes the bad guy, because now you've got something to fall back on. It's like your kids not wanting to go out and do something that they know they shouldn't, and they're maybe afraid to do. They just kind of go, oh, well, my mom and daddy won't let me go. So this is the same thing here, is that this process will take that same thing, meaning that the process, the system, the procedure will not allow me. That's why you and I are talking. So this is the important part of stopping quality, non-quality dead in its tracks, and that's basically by who and what we process, who we give it to, who we pass it to. We're not going to accept or pass on non-quality. That's how we get it here. How do we usually do it? Once the customer calls in and kind of complaining that they hadn't got it, now we jump through hoops to try to fix it. So let's look at the accounting of the order request terms. Another interesting thing as we go through this is that we're going to formalize how we manage, plan, schedule, and monitor that order request through the organization by base work centers. We're saying here that it's just as important for a manager over a department or a division to manage, and it's just as important for a person at their base work center, no matter where they're at in the organizational level, to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor. So let's look at a log is basically a log showing all of the order requests that we're currently processing or receiving or we're going to receive. There's a lot of different things to manage what in the world's coming in, because we have some accounts that basically are dealing with companies that they're looking 6 to 8 months out. So we also want to do some advanced planning and look at what's happening down the road or what potential. This is where we're going to get very proactive instead of reactive internally within the organization. A record is basically anything that's written down. A data collection, the noting, recording, registering in a log, a list, or data bank or whatever. We're saying here the data collection is collecting all the stuff that we're doing internally within the organization in data form. How many things did we process? What product or service went into that order request? This is what we're talking about here. We have to have that data collection. Data entry is once the data has been collected, it's usually downloaded somewhere, sometimes at that base work center, but a lot of times we complete a work order internally within the organization of that order request. We turn it in and then it's downloaded somewhere else. So we're looking at the paper process. This is kind of what we're looking at, filling out the forms and doing all this stuff. The report is a formal accounting of what's happening. The maintenance is to keep up, to continue and carry out actions of our product and service. We're saying here, keep tabs of where we're at, keep in compliance to what we've agreed on and where we're at in our process and steps. Again, the 4 M's, manpower, machine, materials, methods. The MPSM is manage, plan, schedule, and monitor. And so, again, here are the accounting terms, because as we start formalizing our system of order request by processes, we're now going to we will also formalize that data collection. Because we go into some companies and we'll find work orders under the desk on the loading dock. Mine flew off the forklift when I was out in the yard or something. So what we're saying here is that we're going to formalize, manage, plan, schedule, and monitor those work orders, because our question is, if we're losing work orders or a particular part of what we're doing, somebody needs to be managing and planning that. And what you're going to see and monitoring is that they're not holding it accountable and it's informal system. Let's look at page number 9. Page number 9, if you look at, is the office managed order request log. Here, what we're looking at is that I told you a lot of the things that we do from management to support staff or office workers internally within the organization is some of the toughest base work centers we got to define, because if you look at it, it's really undefined. And most of us evolve because we don't have the systems internally to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor. We're literally reacting, putting out fires, and we're not managing, planning, scheduling, and monitoring. So sometimes the most frustrated people in the organization is the support staff, because as the organization grows, their job grows and changes, particularly if we have somebody that's hustling internally within the organization that always gets the deal out on agreed upon terms. So what happens is, what do? We keep loading them down till we burn them out. So what we're saying here, let's agree on, and if you're an office management based work center, that job's continually evolving, and those systems and processes informally are kind of keeping you running from one fire to the next. Why is it important for me to have as an office or support staff? A log, basically, how many times is that your internal supplier came to give you something, you're going like, hey, I'm like, I can't get to that. And they're going, well, what are you doing? You ain't doing nothing. And you're working night and day, but there's nowhere there to even show or reflect what you're doing because you can't even remember what you're doing. You're sitting there and gets very frustrating. So if you look at, if we're logging, and we want to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor, look at those things that we got to do down the road. Plug those things in there on weekend, month end, quarterly, certain reports or certain certifications or mandates that are dictated to our organization. Plan those things in there. Because what we don't want to do is that somebody's wanting you to go order copy paper or something and you got to do a month end. We're saying here is that it's very important to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor. So this log here, what it would help do is that example of your co-worker, supervisor, and sometimes that good worker in the office and the support staff get stuff dumped from other base work centers because they have learned to kind of just, you did one thing for them, now they're kind of dumping all their stuff on you. And this is a good picture of what you're doing internally. And what that's also going to do is suggest what is your base work center. And what you're going to see, 99% of you basically aren't doing what you're hired to do out there. You're taking on more stuff and doing a lot of other things. And this is where the confusion comes and the frustration internally within the organization. So if you look at, there's a couple of things, what we're saying, a login reference number. Reference number could be that work order, purchase order, request order number. And then we're saying when is it request, by what department, and the comments and the time spent. So right here, it'll give you a good block or a good history of what's happening internally. Now, we also have some issues with the office support people that are also answering phones. So then or answering the customer stuff or reporting to other base work centers. What happens is that, I don't know if y'all have ever tried to take a phone call in the middle of something, but it's hard to get not only started, it's hard to finish something. So then that's going to tell us that we're not completing or doing those things that we believe informally is our base work center. We could literally log all the calls that we're taking, and then that's going to tell us, number one, what are those calls and where are they going to, and why is that person receiving them, and or has that job grown or expanded to where maybe now we either need to look at the process and system, is it customer complaints or whatever, but look at it also too is, are we fielding calls that shouldn't be coming here? And or have we grown to a point to where we need to delegate that off to another base work center or create another base work center? Because a lot of our organizations start now is that we're kind of all doing everything, but then it gets to a point that you can no longer outwork it. So then we have to start bringing on other people. Okay, let's look at the page number 10. Page number 10 is the order request generic. And what this is, it's a log or schedule for internally. What we're using this for, at example, one of our companies, they're using this by base work center, by department. Each of the processes, if you look there, there's 4 columns. Basically, each of those processes, as I receive it, as I go through it, and it's basically in and out. So one thing is that for my particular base work center, let's say I'm that particular department's manager, I can have all of those base work centers. Now, let's just say this is by base work center now. Involved in that processing of that order request, I might have 4 different things that I have to do. I might have to set up, I might have to request inventory parts or whatever, or service to support that. Then I have to assemble it, or then I have to get it milled, or I have to get it from some other base work. But that can line out that process not only by department, but also too by base work center. And then that's going to tell you some stuff. Example is I went to pull parts, or I went to get something to support, and it wasn't in inventory. So right there, that's going to tell us if there's some bottlenecks. And remember, we're dealing with data. It's not the fact. Remember, 99% want to do a good job. But what we do is that if we don't meet it, we just go whip everybody in the organization and make sure everybody ain't going to do it again. Then it kind of goes away. then it'll resurface. So if you look at it, it's really when is it required, when is it scheduled, and when is it completed. The toughest thing you're going to have here is dealing with real dates, because as you see, what's going to happen is that with an informal process, I always fudge and say I need it in 2 days. Well, I really need it in a week. And so what happened, it's going to be hard to get people to start trusting as we start formalizing the system, because they're still going to build that cushion in there to make sure they get their job done. And we have a gazillion stories on that from either internally within the office or out in the plant processing a product or a service. Okay, let's look at page number 11. Page number 11 is the flip chart story. And this was a true story. I'll read the life lesson and then we'll talk about this thing. Sometimes the simplest thing to your customer is the most frustrating. It's really, this story here happened at one of our accounts that we had. And what happened was is that we had ordered flip charts. Now that sounds kind of simple. Well, what happened, the organization, a big office supply, they did what they said they're going to do. They get our order there. Well, we got the order out, and the flip chart, you know, one of the ones that hang on a tripod, and whoever had done that, they had folded it in half. So I don't know if y'all have ever tried to write on a folded flip chart. It's almost impossible, and you can't even straighten the thing out. Another interesting thing, I saw it evolve over the years that the flip charts used to come in packs of 2 in cardboard boxes. Well, what we used to do is use those to keep the flip charts in. Well, we had somebody line item managing somewhere and said we could save 11 cents somewhere by taking and just shrink wrapping that. Well, what was happening is that, like with us, now as they were delivering these flip charts, or the customers, they were getting damaged. But we saved 11 cents. And see, and that doesn't start showing up till down the road. So what happened, we called the company. Sure enough, they responded, great customer service, all this stuff. They sent a truck back out that afternoon. Guess what? The flip chart was folded in half again. So if you look at, they addressed the issue, but they still weren't getting the people involved in the process. They just ordered another one and sent it out. So the same person probably folded the thing again because that's the only way they could get it delivered. All of a sudden now has got 2 strikes against them. That thing, I guarantee you, was informal. And the person that basically packed the thing wasn't involved in the decision because I was in too much of a hurry. So this flip chart, as simple as it is and as good as the service, it's still very frustrating to your customer. And it don't take very many things or very many of these little simple things to really frustrate your customer. And when they won't complain, they'll just leave and go away, and they'll be at your competitor down the road. So that what we're saying is a very good example. Now, if you look at internally, we're saying here, let's look at the company that sent us the flip chart. How efficient is that person now running that truck back out? Now, I guarantee at that company, he's going, I ain't got enough time in the day, ain't got this, ain't got that, you're working me. I'm willing to bet they have several redos, reruns, take-backs, and the whole bit because of either quality of product or service. So that's where we're saying like the inefficiencies are, is doing all these little bitty things wrong and having to correct them throughout the day. We kind of did a study in one of our larger companies that it was like costing us $60 an hour to run a truck, and that's, you know, with all insurance and the driver and fuel and all that other stuff. So if you're looking at that one little flip chart that might have cost $6 has now cost them for that hour to get there, and especially if you're out in a large metropolitan area, that $6 thing's now cost us $60 to deliver it. This is what we're saying. By the time bad quality or non-quality gets to your customer, it's too late and it's cost you. And it usually costs you 10 to 100 times more. Okay, so that's kind of what we're looking at. Let's talk about our order request process. We're looking at what this whole thing about is formalizing our order request process or system. Our order is external, our request is internal, and we're looking at formalizing first the request by, if nothing else, that process and step form, by listing the base work centers. And that's going to tell us who on a task team or a process improvement team is going to need to be involved in that decision making. So that's what we're looking at. We'll do it from an overall global view internally within the organization by base work center. Then we're going to formalize that process and steps internally within the organization, specific by step of those base work centers that are affected by it. Let's look at our frequently asked questions. So really all we're doing is looking at formalizing the order request, managing, planning, scheduling, and monitoring. And we've given you some logs and some schedules. We've even given you a generic order request and an office management and a generic schedule and planner. Okay, let's look at number one. What is an order request? Well, I kind of answered that already. Order request is what we're saying. We want to have a formalized system. Order is external, request is internal. Number two, explain how we're all processing, supporting our organization's order request. I don't care if you're in the office, I don't care if you're out on the floor, out in the field or whatever, and our customer service or just answering phones, which is a really big important thing. Don't want to say just answering phones because that's usually our first contact with our customers, is that we're all processing or supporting some part of that order request. And what we're saying there is that order request, why we have to have it broken down by those base work centers and why it has to be formalized by those people that are doing that job. Number three, it says, what is a base work center product service of the order request? What we're saying there is that for that base work center, our product or service is whatever it is I was hired to do and what I do in my base work center to support that. I don't have time to write it down. How many times have you heard that? I ain't got time to do it, but we got time to do it again, don't we? And these are all the things that are killing us internally. Why should a base work center be concerned with managing, planning, scheduling, and monitoring? That's management's job. See, this is the big argument we had a lot out there with why are these base skills and who are they for? The base skills are for everybody internally within the organization. Why? Because we have to have the skills to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor my part of supporting that order request. No, it's not management's job. All of our jobs, that's why we're saying a base work center, we use the term self-managed, to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor my part. Availabilities to process, support our capacities and inventory. We really need to get a handle on what we can and what we can't do and the capacities and the inventories to support what we're making commitments for. The only way we're going to do that is with a formal process. What is an order request log schedule? Order request is basically how we're logging that thing as we're receiving it, and we're looking at the schedule basically is we're now using that same form or that generic form to also schedule it. So if you look at what we're talking about, formalizing our order request by base work centers internally. So we want you to think about that. And thanks and have a good day.